I slammed my fist against the marble podium so hard that a crack split through the stone, and 600 delegates from across the galactic conclave went silent. "I refuse," I said, and my voice carried through the grand chamber like a blade through still water. Lord Sithis of the Draven hegemony stood 20 paces from me, his massive frame draped in ceremonial armor the color of dried blood, his 4 eyes narrowed to slits. Behind him, his retinue of warriors shifted on their feet, hands drifting toward weapons that were supposed to have been left at the chamber doors. He had come here expecting a formality. He had come here expecting me to bow, to accept the merger contract my mother had spent 3 years negotiating, to let him take me back to Draven Prime as his political bride and strategic asset. He had not expected me to look him in the face and say no. "You dare," Sithis breathed, and even his whisper shook the floor with its bass resonance. The Draven were a species engineered for intimidation. Every part of them, from their towering height to their resonant vocal cords, was designed to make smaller creatures submit. I was half his size. I weighed a third of what he weighed, and I did not care. "I dare," I said. "I reject the merger contract. I reject the terms of union. I reject you, Lord Sithis, as a suitor, as an ally, and as anything other than a guest in this chamber who has overstayed his welcome." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes an explosion. I could feel my mother's gaze burning into the back of my skull from the Empress's gallery above. I could feel the shock rippling through the delegates like a physical wave. No one refused a Draven warlord. No one refused them publicly, and absolutely no one did it with 600 witnesses watching. Sithis's upper lip peeled back over teeth that could crush titanium alloy. "This is not a request, Princess Valith. This is a negotiated union between sovereign powers. Your mother, the Empress Dryani, signed the preliminary accord herself." "My mother can sign whatever she wishes," I said, "but she cannot sign away my life, not anymore." I turned my back on him. That alone was an act of war in Draven culture. I knew it. I did it anyway. I walked out of the grand chamber, while 600 voices erupted behind me, while Sithis's roar of fury shook dust from the ancient ceiling, while my mother's guards scrambled to intercept me in the corridor. They caught up to me outside the western gallery, 4 of them, wearing the white armor of the imperial household, positioning themselves in a diamond formation around me, not to protect me, to contain me. "The Empress wishes to speak with you immediately," the lead guard said. "I am certain she does." They escorted me to the private audience chamber on the upper level. My mother was already there, standing at the center of the room like a pillar of cold fury. Empress Drayani Sorayen was tall even by our species standards, her features sharp and angular, her silver-white hair pulled back in the ceremonial braids of our house. She had been beautiful once, before decades of political maneuvering had turned her face into a mask of permanent calculation. "You have destroyed 3 years of diplomatic work in 30 seconds, she said. "No greeting, no formality, just the blade. I destroyed a contract that would have sold me to a warlord." Sithis controls the Draven trade corridor. Without that alliance, we lose access to 40% of our supply routes. Do you understand what that means for our people, Valith? Famine, shortage, vulnerability to every minor house that has been waiting for a crack in our armor. Then find another way to secure the corridor, one that does not require handing your daughter to a creature who has buried 2 previous wives. My mother's expression did not change. It never did. That was perhaps the thing I hated most about these conversations. She could discuss selling her own child with the same detached composure she used to review agricultural reports. "This was your 7th refusal," she said quietly. 7 suitors. 7 houses. You have alienated the Draven, the Kelvari, the Thoshan Collective, and 4 independent systems. There is no corner of this galaxy where your reputation has not preceded you. The princess who cannot be wed. The princess who bites. Good. Let them know. This is not a game. Her voice dropped, and for the first time something real flickered behind her eyes. Not warmth, something closer to desperation. "I have exhausted my patience and my options. You will accept a suitor within 1 galactic rotation, or I will formally strip you of your title, your bloodline privileges, and your place in the succession. You will be exiled, Valith. Not as a princess in hiding, as no one. I met her gaze and held it. Then I will be no one. She stared at me for a long time. I think she was searching for something in my eyes. Fear, perhaps. Regret. Some crack in my armor that she could exploit. She did not find one. Very well, she said finally. If you wish to be humiliated, I will oblige. There is a diplomatic posting available. A minor envoy assignment to a world that has just been admitted to the galactic community. It requires a representative of noble rank, and no one of any importance will take it. Where? Earth. I had heard of Earth. Every species in the galaxy had heard of Earth by now, though few took it seriously. A small blue planet on the fringe of an unremarkable spiral arm, inhabited by a species so young they had barely mastered interstellar travel. Humans, they called themselves. Deathworlders, others called them, though that classification applied to the planet more than the people. Their world was a violent, unpredictable place of extreme weather, tectonic instability, and predatory ecosystems. The fact that anything intelligent had evolved there at all was considered a statistical anomaly. You want me to babysit primitives, I said. I want you out of my sight before you cause any more damage. The posting is effective immediately. You leave in 6 hours. I left in 4. I took a small diplomatic vessel with a skeleton crew. No honor guard, no attendants. Just my pilot, a navigation officer, and the growing silence that filled the ship as we traveled farther and farther from everything I had ever known. I did not regret what I had done. I had watched what happened to the women of my bloodline when they accepted these mergers. My older sister, Kalis, had been given to a Kelvari warlord when she was barely 16 cycles old. She had sent messages home for 2 years. Bright messages at first, full of descriptions of the Kelvari homeworld, its strange orange skies and crystalline forests. Then the messages grew shorter, then less frequent, then they stopped entirely. I found out later that Kalis had been stripped of her identity. The Kelvari called it harmonization. They broke down a partner's personality and rebuilt it to fit their cultural expectations. My sister, who had loved music and mathematics and could argue philosophy until the stars burned out, was reduced to a silent figure in ceremonial robes, who stood behind her husband and spoke only when spoken to. I went to my mother. I begged her to intervene. She told me it was the cost of empire. That was the day I swore I would never marry. Not for politics, not for power, not for any reason that required me to become less than what I was. Earth's solar system appeared on our navigation display 17 days after departure. It was an unremarkable yellow star surrounded by 8 planets, the third of which showed the swirling blue and white patterns of a living world. As we approached, I felt nothing. No curiosity, no excitement, just the dull resignation of a princess, sent to the edges of relevance as punishment for having a spine. We landed in a human city called Geneva, at a facility they called the Interstellar Liaison Office. It was modest by galactic standards, clean, functional, efficient, but utterly lacking in grandeur. No soaring crystal towers, no orbital reception platforms, just a series of gray buildings surrounded by green earth and a mountain range that, I had to admit, possessed a certain raw beauty. My assigned counterpart was waiting on the landing pad when I descended the ramp. He was a human male, average height by their species standards, which made him short by mine. Brown hair cut close, a face that was weathered and lined in ways that suggested he had spent significant time in environments that were not kind to him. He wore a dark formal uniform with several small metal decorations on the chest that I assumed indicated rank or achievement. I expected him to bow. Every species in the galaxy bowed when receiving a princess of the Saurian Dominion. It was protocol. It was acknowledgement of station. He extended his hand toward me and smiled. "Commander Ethan Crow," he said. "Welcome to Earth, Your Highness. I hope the flight was smooth." I looked at his outstretched hand. I had been briefed on this custom during the journey. Humans pressed their palms together as a greeting. It was a gesture rooted in an ancient tradition of showing that one carried no weapon. Primitive, quaint. I took his hand. His grip was firm and warm. He shook once, released, and stepped back. "The flight was adequate," I said. "Great, I have a car waiting. We will get you settled at the diplomatic residence, and then I figured we could do a quick tour of the compound tomorrow morning. Unless you are tired, in which case, we can push everything to the afternoon. Your call. I stared at him. Your call. 2 words that no one in my entire life had ever said to me. Every decision about my existence had been made by someone else, for reasons that served someone else. My education, my wardrobe, my schedule, my future husband. And here stood this unremarkable man from an unremarkable world, and the first thing he offered me was a choice. The morning will be fine, I said. Morning it is. He turned and gestured toward a wheeled ground vehicle at the edge of the pad. Watch your step on the way down. The ramp gets slippery when it rains, and it rains here about 300 days a year. I followed him to the vehicle, and as we drove through the streets of Geneva, I watched the human world slide past the windows. Buildings of stone and glass, pedestrians in colorful clothing, moving in every direction without the rigid formation walking that governed public movement on my homeworld. Trees with green leaves that moved in the wind. Small domestic animals being led on tethers by their owners. Tongues hanging out, tails wagging. It was chaotic, unstructured, messy. And Ethan Crow drove through it all with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the open window, as if the chaos was not something to be managed but something to be enjoyed. I looked away and told myself I felt nothing. But something had shifted, something small and quiet, like a door opening in a room I had thought was sealed forever. Because in 30 years of life, through 7 rejected suitors, and 100 formal receptions, and 1,000 interactions with the most powerful beings in the galaxy, not one of them had ever looked at me the way this human did. Not at my title, not at my bloodline, not at the political value wrapped around my name like chains. He looked at me like I was a person, and I had absolutely no idea what to do with that. The diplomatic residence was a 2-story building near the edge of the compound, surrounded by tall trees and a garden that someone clearly tended with great care. My quarters occupied the entire upper floor. They were simple by the standards I was accustomed to, but clean and comfortable, with large windows that looked out over the mountains. I stood at those windows for a long time that first night, watching the lights of Geneva flicker against the dark slopes, and tried to convince myself that this exile was temporary, that I would endure it, return home when the political winds shifted, and resume my life. I did not know then how wrong I was. I did not know that I would never resume my old life, because the person who had lived it was about to stop existing. Ethan arrived the next morning, precisely on time, carrying 2 cups of a dark liquid that he called coffee. He offered one to me without ceremony. You might not like it, he said. Most species find it bitter. But it is basically the fuel that runs human civilization, so I figured you should at least try it. I took a sip. It was terrible. Bitter, acrid, and sharp. I took another sip. It was still terrible, but there was something underneath the bitterness. Something warm and complex and almost alive. It is acceptable, I said. He grinned. That is what everyone says right before they get addicted. The tour of the compound took most of the morning. Ethan walked me through the offices, the communications center, the cultural exchange wing, and the small military liaison station, where a handful of human soldiers coordinated with galactic security networks. He introduced me to his staff. They were all polite, all professional, and all completely unintimidated by my rank. A woman named Lucy Wells, who served as the compound's cultural attaché, shook my hand and immediately asked if I had any dietary restrictions she should know about. A logistics officer named Daniel Park argued cheerfully with Ethan about the schedule for my briefings, right in front of me, as if debating with a superior officer was a perfectly normal thing to do. I was bewildered. On my homeworld, subordinates did not argue with their superiors. They did not address nobles without permission. They certainly did not offer them beverages and ask about their eating habits as if they were old friends. The entire social structure of this place was upside down, and no one seemed to notice or care. After the tour, Ethan sat me down in a conference room and briefed me on Earth's political structure. It was, without question, the most confusing thing I had ever encountered. Hundreds of independent nations, each with their own government, multiple competing economic systems, ongoing territorial disputes, ideological factions that spanned national boundaries, religious institutions with no political authority that somehow wielded enormous political influence. How does anything function? I asked, genuinely mystified. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Badly, mostly. But we get there. Humans are good at figuring things out on the fly. We argue about everything, disagree about almost everything, and somehow manage to cooperate just enough to keep the whole thing from falling apart. That sounds exhausting. It is. But it also means nobody gets to make decisions for everyone else. We tried that a few times in our history. It always ended badly. I looked at him sharply. Nobody makes decisions for everyone else? Not permanently. We have leaders, sure, but they serve at the will of the people they lead. If they stop serving well, they get replaced. Sometimes through elections, sometimes through louder methods. I thought about my mother, about the conclave, about a system where power flowed downward from the top and obedience flowed upward from the bottom, and no one questioned the arrangement because it was the way things had always been. That is either the most brilliant system of governance I have ever heard of, I said, or the most insane. Ethan shrugged. Probably both. That evening, I attended a small gathering at the compound. Ethan had described it as a casual dinner among staff, something they did regularly to maintain morale. I expected a formal affair with structured seating and careful protocol. What I found was a room full of humans eating, laughing, arguing, and talking over each other in a way that would have caused a diplomatic incident on any civilized world in the galaxy. I sat in the corner and observed, the way I had been trained to observe at court. But this was nothing like court. There were no factions maneuvering for position, no careful words chosen for their double meanings, no veiled threats or strategic silences. These people were simply enjoying each other's presence. The noise was not chaos. It was warmth. A young officer named Sam Harding sat nearby, with a woman I did not recognize. She was small, with dark curly hair and a smile that seemed to take up half her face. They sat close together. She touched his arm while telling a story about something that had happened at her workplace. He watched her with an expression I could not identify. It was soft, open, unguarded, like she was the only person in the room, and he could not quite believe his luck. I watched them the way a scientist watches an unfamiliar species, cataloging every gesture, every glance, every unconscious lean of their bodies toward each other. This was not performance. It was not negotiation. It was something organic and effortless, and completely alien to everything I had ever known. Later, I found Ethan at the edge of the gathering, the woman with Officer Harding. I said, "Which political house does she belong to?" Ethan frowned. "She does not belong to any political house. She is a school teacher. Her name is Grace. They met at a bookshop about 2 years ago." A school teacher. I processed this. He is a military officer with rank and strategic value. Why would he bind himself to someone with no political advantage? Surely his superiors expected a more beneficial arrangement. His superiors do not have a say in who he marries. Nobody does. That is kind of the whole point. Then why? What does he gain? Ethan was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Because he loves her," he said simply. Love? I said the word like it was a foreign object in my mouth. I knew the concept. I had read about it in human cultural files during my briefings. But knowing about something and understanding it were entirely different things. "Yeah, love." Ethan turned to face me. "It is not a contract. It is not a merger. It is just two people deciding that they want to be together. Not because they have to. Because they want to. Because life is better with that person in it than without them. And this is sufficient? Wanting? For us it is. Sometimes, it is the only thing that is. We have fought wars over it, built cities because of it, crossed oceans and deserts and, eventually, the space between stars, because someone we loved was on the other side, or because we wanted to build something worth sharing with the person beside us." I looked back at Sam and Grace. He was laughing at something she said, his whole body turned toward her like a plant toward sunlight. There was no strategy in it, no calculation, just raw, unguarded joy in the presence of another person. It seems like a weakness, I said. Binding yourself to someone for something as fragile as emotion. Emotions change. Emotions can be manipulated. Contracts at least have enforcement mechanisms. Ethan nodded slowly. Maybe it looks that way from the outside, but I have seen people move mountains because of love, survive things that should have killed them, come back from places no one comes back from, all because someone was waiting for them on the other side. I have seen a mother lift wreckage off her child that 3 grown men could not budge. I have seen soldiers carry wounded comrades for miles through enemy territory because they promised they would bring them home. Love is not fragile, Valith. It is the strongest thing we have. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I had spent my entire life in a civilization that viewed marriage as architecture, as structural engineering, as the careful assembly of political machines designed to produce power. And here was a species that built their most important bonds on something invisible, unquantifiable, and entirely voluntary. It was absurd. But watching Sam Harding look at Grace like she was the reason the universe existed, I could not bring myself to call it weak. That night, alone in my quarters, I thought about my sister Kalis, about the way her eyes used to light up when she talked about harmonic mathematics, about the way she used to hum melodies she had composed herself, filling the palace corridors with sounds that made even the guards stop and listen, about the messages that stopped coming, about the hollow figure in Kelvari robes that I had seen in a diplomatic transmission 2 years later, standing behind a warlord who had systematically erased everything she was. Kalis had not been given a choice. None of us were given choices. We were given duties and told that duty was the highest form of purpose. That personal desire was selfishness, that a princess who wanted something for herself was a princess who had failed her bloodline. I wondered, for the first time, if that was a lie. I wondered if the humans, with their chaotic governments and their irrational attachments and their strange, fierce insistence on choosing their own paths, had stumbled onto something that 1,000 years of galactic civilization had missed. 3 weeks passed. My duties as diplomatic envoy were minimal. Earth's relationship with the galactic community was still in its infancy, and the official business that required my attention could be handled in an hour each morning. The rest of my time was unstructured, which was a new and disorienting experience for someone who had been scheduled down to the minute for her entire life. Ethan filled the gaps without being asked. He took me to human museums, where I stood in front of paintings by artists who had been dead for centuries, and felt something I could not name stirring in my chest. One painting showed a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out over a stormy sea, her hair blown back by wind you could almost feel through the canvas. It was raw and emotional and completely impractical, and I stood in front of it for 20 minutes without speaking. He took me to a concert, where a single human sat on a stage and drew sounds from a stringed instrument that made my throat ache. The music had no purpose. It carried no political message, conveyed no strategic information, served no function in any system I understood. It existed purely to make people feel something, and it did. It reached inside me and touched something that had been locked away so long I had forgotten it was there. He took me to a market where humans sold food they had grown with their own hands, and an old woman offered me a piece of fruit and called me dear, without knowing or caring that I was a princess of a galactic empire. I ate the fruit, and it was sweet and messy, and juice ran down my chin, and for the first time in my life, I did not care about dignity. I found myself looking forward to these outings, with a hunger that frightened me. I found myself looking for Ethan, in a room, before I looked for anyone else. I found myself laughing at his dry observations about galactic politics, which were sharper and more insightful than anything I had heard from professional diplomats twice his age. He had a way of cutting through complexity that I envied. He saw the truth of things not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because he was not afraid to name what others tiptoed around. And then the message came. It arrived on an encrypted channel, routed through 3 relay stations to avoid interception. The conclave had granted Lord Scythus the right of claim, an ancient law, rarely invoked, that permitted a rejected suitor to challenge the refusing party's house for the union by force. If I did not submit to the merger, Scythus could legally bring military action against the entire Saurian dominion. My mother's forces could resist, but the Draven hegemony was larger, better armed, and had allies of its own. The calculus was brutal and simple: my freedom or my people's safety. My refusal had not just embarrassed Scythus. It had given him a weapon. I sat alone in my quarters and read the message 3 times. The words blurred and sharpened and blurred again. The walls felt closer. The mountains outside my window, which had begun to feel like something approaching home, suddenly looked like the walls of a cage. A larger cage. A more beautiful cage, but a cage nonetheless. I was going to have to go back to the conclave, back to the cold marble halls and colder negotiations, back to a future where my only value was the strategic weight of my bloodline and the political leverage of my body. A knock at my door. I opened it to find Ethan standing in the corridor, holding 2 cups of coffee. He took one look at my face, and his expression changed. The easy warmth vanished, replaced by something sharp and alert. "What happened?" he asked. I should have dismissed him. I should have closed the door and handled this alone, the way I had handled everything alone for my entire life. That was what I had been trained to do. That was what was expected of a Saurian princess. Strength meant solitude. Vulnerability was a weapon your enemies used against you. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in. And as I told him about the right of claim, about Scythus, about the threat hanging over everything I had left behind, I realized that this was the first time I had ever told anyone the truth about my life, without calculating the strategic implications of honesty. Ethan listened without interrupting. He sat across from me in the simple chair by the window, and he listened with his entire body, leaning forward, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he did not offer solutions or strategies or political maneuvers. He just sat there quietly for a moment, his jaw tight, and then he said, "I am sorry. That is not fair." Not fair. Such a simple, human thing to say. Not strategic, not pragmatic. Just the raw acknowledgement that what was happening to me was wrong. In the courts of the Dominion, no one ever said things were unfair. Fairness was not a concept that applied to power. Power simply was. You wielded it, or you were crushed by it, and complaining about the arrangement was like complaining about gravity. But Ethan looked at the situation, and his first instinct was not to calculate advantage, it was to name the injustice. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup and held on tight, because something inside my chest was cracking, and I was afraid that if I let go, I would fall apart entirely. I spent the next 2 days preparing to leave Earth. I contacted my crew. I reviewed the political situation through back channels. I studied the right of claim from every legal angle, looking for a loophole, an exception, anything I could use to invalidate Scythus's petition. I combed through centuries of conclave records, reading precedents until my eyes burned. There was nothing. The law was ancient and airtight, written in an era when brute force was considered the ultimate measure of a suitor's worth. My options were narrowing by the hour: accept the merger and lose myself, refuse and watch my people suffer the consequences, flee into obscurity and abandon everyone who depended on the Saurian bloodline. Each path led somewhere dark. Ethan found me in the communications room on the second day, surrounded by legal documents and diplomatic correspondence. I had not slept. I had not eaten. I was running on coffee and fury, and the desperate, stubborn refusal to accept that this was how my story ended. He pulled up a chair and sat down beside me without asking permission. "I talked to my people," he said. "Your people?" "Earth Interstellar Command. I made a case to Admiral Patricia Calloway. Earth has been looking for an opportunity to establish deeper ties with a major galactic power. A formal alliance with the Saurian Dominion, through a mutual defense and trade treaty, rather than a forced marriage, would give your mother the strategic partnership she needs, without sacrificing you." I stared at him. "You went to your military command, on my behalf, without telling me." "I went on behalf of a good outcome. Your situation is bad politics by any standard. Forcing someone into a union under threat of war is not alliance building. It is extortion. Earth does not do business that way, and we would rather support a partner who does not either. And they agreed? They are sending a diplomatic envoy with you, backed by a carrier group. 3 carriers, 18 support ships. Not to fight, just to be visible. To make it clear that Earth has an interest in the Saurian Dominion's sovereignty, and that we consider the right of claim to be incompatible with the principles of free association. I felt something shift inside me. Not the cracking sensation from before, something else. Something warm and unfamiliar, and terrifying, like sunlight breaking through a ceiling I had thought was solid stone. Why? I asked him. Why would you do this? Earth gains nothing from antagonizing the Draven hegemony. You are a young species with a small fleet. You cannot afford enemies at this stage. We gain an ally who shares our values. That is worth more than any trade corridor. That is naive. Maybe. Humans are good at naive. We believed we could fly before we built planes. We believed we could reach the stars before we built rockets. We believed in things before they were possible, and then we made them possible. It is kind of our thing. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to poke holes in his logic, to explain that the galaxy did not work on optimism and good intentions, that power was the only language the Conclave understood. I had a dozen counter-arguments ready, each one sharpened by years of political education. But I could not deploy them, because he was sitting there with absolute certainty in his eyes, not the blind certainty of someone who did not understand the risks, but the clear-eyed certainty of someone who understood them completely and chose to act anyway. You are coming with me, I said. It was not a question. I am coming with you. Not as a suitor. Not as a suitor, as a friend. I looked at him, and something moved through me that I had no word for in my language. My people had thousands of words for different types of political alliance, for various grades of strategic partnership, for the precise calibrations of power and obligation that bound houses together. But we had no word for this. For the feeling of looking at someone and knowing, with a certainty that went beyond logic or strategy, that they would stand beside you not because they had to, not because it served their interests, but simply because they had decided to. My people had never needed a word for it. I was beginning to think that was the greatest failure of our civilization. The journey to the Saurian homeworld took 19 days. My small diplomatic vessel traveled alongside the human envoy ship, the Resolute, and behind us at a careful distance, the Earth carrier group held formation. 3 carriers, 18 support vessels, a show of force that was modest by galactic standards, but significant for a species that had only been part of the interstellar community for a decade. Ethan traveled on my ship at my request. We spent the long transit days reviewing strategy, eating meals together in the cramped galley, and talking in ways that had nothing to do with the crisis we were flying toward. He had a mind for diplomacy that surprised me. He did not think like the galactic negotiators I was accustomed to, who approached every interaction as a zero-sum game, where one side's gain was the other's loss. He thought in terms of mutual benefit, of creative solutions, of outcomes where both sides walked away with something they valued. The trick is not to win, he told me once, standing at the observation window, as the stars slid past like scattered diamonds. The trick is to make sure nobody has to lose. People fight hardest when they are backed into a corner. Give them a way out that lets them keep their dignity, and half the time they will take it. And the other half? The other half? You need a really big stick. I almost smiled. Almost. Is that what the carrier group is? A really big stick? More like a politely implied really big stick. There is an art to it. We also talked about things that had nothing to do with strategy. He told me about growing up in a coastal city, about the sound of the ocean at night, about learning to sail as a child, and the way the wind felt when you caught it just right. He told me about his career in the naval service, about the ships he had served on, and the places they had taken him. He described sunsets on worlds I had never heard of, storms he had flown through, the strange peace of deep space when the engines were quiet and the stars were the only light. And he told me about the Ardent. It was a light patrol vessel, assigned to escort duty near the Callisto corridor. A routine mission, the kind of mission that never made the news because nothing ever happened on them. Except that something did happen. A pirate flotilla, better armed and better organized than anyone expected, hit the convoy at the transit point. The Ardent held them off long enough for the civilian ships to escape. Ethan coordinated the defense, running between stations as systems failed one by one, patching together solutions from wreckage, while the hull breached around him. The Ardent itself did not escape. 11 crew members died. Ethan survived. He did not explain how, and I did not ask. But I noticed that sometimes, in quiet moments, his hand drifted to his left side, pressing against his ribs, as if checking that something was still there. "I carry their names," he said once, so quietly, I almost did not hear him. "Tattooed on my ribs, where no one can see, so they are always with me." I understood then that this man was not what I had initially assumed. He was not naive. He was not soft. He was someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side, still caring about other people, still willing to put himself in harm's way for strangers, still capable of kindness after experiencing the kind of loss that broke most beings into pieces. On my homeworld, grief was a private weakness to be concealed. You buried it deep and built walls around it and pretended it did not exist, because to show grief was to show vulnerability, and vulnerability was an invitation for your enemies to strike. On Ethan's world, grief was a wound worn openly, tended carefully, and transformed into purpose. It was not something to be hidden, it was something to be honored. I was not sure which approach was healthier, but I knew which one felt more honest. We arrived at the Saurian system on the 20th day. The homeworld filled the forward viewport, a massive planet of violet oceans and silver continents, ringed by orbital defense platforms that glittered like a crown of steel. I had seen this view 1,000 times. It had always looked like home. Now, it looked like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. "Ready?" Ethan asked, standing beside me at the viewport. "No," I said honestly. "Good. Means you are taking it seriously." He paused. "For what it is worth, I have seen you handle 7 different diplomatic crises in the past 3 weeks, and you were brilliant in every single one. You are going to walk in there, and they are going to remember why they were afraid of you in the first place." I looked at him, this human who had traveled across the galaxy for me, who had mobilized his planet's military resources for me, who stood here now, in the shadow of a world that could crush him without a thought, and told me I was brilliant. "Ethan." "Yeah?" I wanted to say something that captured the impossible, terrifying, magnificent thing that was building inside my chest every time he looked at me. Something that would make him understand that he had already changed my life in ways I could not begin to calculate. Instead, I said, "Your coffee is terrible." He laughed. It was a good sound, warm and real, and completely unguarded. "I know," he said. "I will make you a better cup when this is over." I turned back to the viewport and watched my homeworld grow larger, and I held on to that promise like a lifeline. The Saurian capital was a city of glass and light, built into the side of a mountain range that stretched across the northern continent like the spine of a sleeping giant. The imperial palace sat at its highest point, a structure of crystalline spires and floating platforms that had taken 300 years to complete. I had grown up in those spires. I knew every corridor, every hidden passage, every room where the walls were thin enough to hear conversations that were meant to be private. I had not missed it, not even slightly. Our landing drew an audience. Word had traveled ahead of us. The princess who had been exiled in disgrace was returning, and she was bringing aliens with her. Humans, of all things. The species that everyone acknowledged as surprisingly resilient, but that no one took seriously as a political force. The docking platform was crowded with courtiers, military officials, and representatives from at least a dozen houses. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and carefully concealed alarm. I descended the ramp in full ceremonial dress, my silver-white hair braided in the patterns of my house, my bearing as rigid and cold as the mountains around us. I knew how to play this game. I had been playing it since I could walk. The mask of the princess settled over me like armor, and I let it. Ethan walked beside me in his dress uniform, his back straight, his expression calm and unreadable. Behind us came the human diplomatic delegation, 6 officers and 2 civilian advisors. They were outnumbered, outweighed, and outsized by virtually everyone on the platform. The shortest Saurian courtier still towered over the tallest human delegate. They did not look intimidated. Not one of them. They walked onto that platform like they owned it, and something about their collective steadiness sent a murmur through the assembled crowd. My mother was not at the landing platform. That was a message in itself. The Empress did not greet disgraced daughters. I would have to go to her, hat in hand, and acknowledge the power dynamic. It was a small cruelty wrapped in protocol. But someone else was there. Lord Scythus stood at the far end of the platform, flanked by his retinue of Draven warriors. He was larger than I remembered. His ceremonial armor had been replaced by something heavier, more martial, designed to make a statement about what he intended to do if the conclave did not give him what he wanted. "The runaway princess returns," he said, loud enough for the entire platform to hear. "And she brings pets." A ripple of amusement went through the assembled courtiers. Ethan did not react. Not a flinch, not a tightening of his jaw, not a flicker in his eyes. He stood beside me with his hands clasped behind his back and his chin level, and said absolutely nothing. It was, I realized later, the most devastating response he could have given. By refusing to acknowledge the insult, he made Scythus look like a bully shouting into empty air. "Lord Scythus," I said, my voice carrying the same cold authority I had used in the Grand Chamber months ago. "I see you have been busy in my absence, filing ancient legal claims, mobilizing fleets, threatening an entire empire for the sake of one woman who does not want you. One might wonder what that says about your confidence in your own worth." His eyes narrowed. "It says, I do not accept insults from children who do not understand the weight of their own bloodline. The right of claim is granted. You will submit, or your house will burn. We shall see what the conclave decides." I walked past him without another word. Ethan fell into step beside me, and as we entered the palace corridors, he leaned close and murmured, "He is scared." "Scared? He has a fleet twice the size of ours." "Exactly. A man who has to bring an army to a marriage proposal knows he has already lost the argument. He is trying to win by intimidation because he cannot win on merit. I have seen 100 officers like him, loud when they have the advantage, brittle when someone takes it away." I glanced at him. "You read people well for a human." "I read people well for anyone. It is why they made me a diplomat instead of letting me keep driving warships." The conclave was scheduled to convene the following morning. That gave me one night to prepare. I spent it in my old quarters, which had been maintained in my absence with the precise, impersonal care of a museum exhibit. Everything was exactly as I had left it. My books on the shelves in the same order, my star charts still pinned to the wall, the small crystalline sculpture Kalis had made for me when I was 10 cycles old, sitting on the bedside table where it caught the light and split it into rainbows. I held the sculpture and thought about my sister, about what was at stake. Not just for me, but for every daughter of every house who would come after me. If I submitted to the right of claim, it would set a precedent that would echo for generations. It would tell every warlord in the galaxy that they could take what they wanted as long as they had enough ships to back up the demand. I would not let that happen, whatever it cost me, whatever it required. A chime at my door. I opened it expecting Ethan, but instead found my mother standing in the corridor alone. No guards, no attendants, no entourage of advisors whispering in her ear, just the Empress, in a simple robe, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen her. "May I come in?" she asked. In 30 years, my mother had never asked permission to enter a room in her own palace. The request was so unexpected that I stepped aside without thinking. She walked to the window and looked out at the city below, the glass towers catching the last light of the dying sun. "I have reviewed the human treaty offer," she said, her back to me. "It is more generous than I expected. More comprehensive, too. Whoever drafted it understands our strategic vulnerabilities better than most of our own advisors. Ethan is a skilled negotiator." The human. She said it without contempt, but also without warmth. "A clinical observation. You trust him?" "Yes." She turned to face me. "The right of claim is not just about Sithis. You understand that. Half the conclave supports him because they fear the Draven fleet. The other half supports him because they see an opportunity to bring our house to heel. I have spent the last 6 months trying to build a coalition against the claim, and I have failed. Every favor I called in, every deal I offered, every veiled threat I deployed. It was not enough. I have a plan. I know. I read your preliminary brief to the conclave. The right of sovereign refusal. You want to present the human alliance as a superior alternative to the Draven merger. She paused. It might work. The law is sound. But Cetus will not accept a legal defeat. He will push for something physical, something primal, a trial of worth. I know. And if he does, the human alliance means nothing, unless you have a champion who can stand against a Draven warrior. Their bio-enhanced elites have never been defeated in formal combat. Not once in 4 centuries. I know. My mother studied me for a long, quiet moment. The mask she usually wore had slipped, and underneath it, I saw something I had not seen since I was a child. Not the Empress, just a mother. Tired and frightened and carrying the weight of an empire on shoulders that were beginning to bow. Be careful, Valeth, she said. I have lost one daughter to this system already. I do not wish to lose another. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I stood there, holding Kaelus's sculpture, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother not as the cold, calculating empress who traded her children for political advantage, but as a woman who had made terrible choices because she believed she had no other options, because the system she was born into gave her no other options, because no one had ever shown her that another way was possible. I will be careful, I said. She nodded once and left without another word. I did not sleep that night. The Grand Conclave chamber was ancient. It had been carved from the living rock of the mountain itself, a vast amphitheater with tiers of seats rising into shadow and a central floor of polished black stone that reflected the light from crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling 100 feet above. Every major house in the Dominion had a seat. Every allied faction, every tributary world, every observer species with diplomatic ties to our government was represented. The chamber held over 1,000 beings, and when I walked onto the central floor the next morning, every single one of them was watching me. Cetus stood on the opposing side of the floor, flanked by his legal advocates and his personal guard. He wore full battle dress. Another message, another threat delivered through wardrobe. I wore the white ceremonial robes of my house, unadorned except for the silver sigil of the Saurian Dominion embroidered on my chest. No armor, no weapons, no jewelry. I wanted them to see me, not a warrior, not a pawn, not a bargaining chip, a princess who had come to fight with words and law, and the strength of her convictions. Ethan and the human delegation sat in the observer gallery. He caught my eye across the chamber and gave me the smallest nod. It steadied me more than any amount of armor could have. The conclave speaker, a Saurian elder named Torvon, called the session to order. Cetus's advocates presented the right of claim first. They were thorough. They cited precedent, historical examples, exhaustive legal analysis. The right of claim was ancient, established, and had been upheld 17 times in the Dominion's history. Every single time the refusing party had submitted. The precedent was overwhelming and unbroken. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward and invoked the right of sovereign refusal. A murmur went through the chamber like wind through dry grass. The law was older than the right of claim, older than the conclave itself, predating the formation of the Dominion by centuries. It held that any heir of a sovereign house could refuse a claim if they could demonstrate an alternative alliance of equal or greater strategic value. It had not been invoked in living memory. Most of the delegates had forgotten it existed. I present to the conclave a formal treaty of mutual defense, trade cooperation, and technological exchange between the Saurian Dominion and the government of Earth, I said. My voice did not waver, not once. This treaty provides the strategic depth that Lord Cetus claims his merger would offer, without the surrender of sovereign agency that the right of claim demands. I laid out the terms with precision: trade access to Earth's growing network of commercial partners, military cooperation, including shared intelligence and joint patrol of contested space, technological exchange in fields where human innovation was already surprising the galaxy, from adaptive materials science to computational systems, joint development of transit corridor infrastructure that would reduce our dependence on any single trade route, including the Draven corridor. Everything my mother needed for the Dominion's security. Everything the Conclave valued, delivered without the cost of a forced marriage. The chamber stirred. Delegates leaned toward each other, whispering urgently. The treaty was solid. Ethan and his team had crafted it with precision, and I had refined it with an insider's knowledge of exactly what each faction in the Conclave needed to hear. Scythus watched it all, with fury building behind his eyes, like pressure behind a dam. When I finished, he stood. "This is theater," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "A treaty with primitives. Humans have no fleet to speak of. No territory of consequence. No history of galactic engagement. Their offer is a fantasy propped up by sentiment and naivety. What are they? A backwater species from a world that tries to kill its own inhabitants. They have nothing that the Dominion requires." He turned to the gallery where Ethan sat. "What strength does your species bring to this alliance, human? What can you offer that is not a fantasy, dressed up in diplomatic language?" The chamber waited. Ethan stood slowly. He was the smallest person in the room by a significant margin. Every eye was on him, and most of those eyes held something between skepticism and open amusement. "Lord Scythus," Ethan said, and his voice carried with a clarity and calm that surprised the chamber into deeper silence. "You are right, that Earth is new to the galactic stage. Our fleet is small. Our territory is limited. Our history out here is short, but you are wrong about our strength." He paused, letting the words settle. "The right of claim exists to prove that a suitor's house can provide strength and protection to the merged bloodline. That is its stated purpose. But strength is not just the number of ships in a fleet, or the size of a warrior's fist. Strength is the willingness to stand beside someone when it costs you something, to defend a principle when it would be easier to look away, to show up, even when you are outgunned and outmatched, and everyone expects you to fail, because the cause is right." He looked directly at Scythus. "You brought a fleet to force a woman into a marriage she does not want. You invoked an ancient law not because you believe in its principles, but because it was the only tool left after she told you no. Where I come from, a man who has to force someone to stay has already lost them." The silence that followed was absolute. 1,000 beings, and not one of them breathed. Scythus's face contorted. Pretty words from a pretty creature. But the Conclave does not run on words. It runs on power. It runs on strength. And your species has neither. Then test it. Ethan's voice did not rise by even a fraction. If you believe that strength is all that matters, then prove it in the way your traditions demand. But do not hide behind legal technicalities and pretend it is anything other than what it is, a man too proud to accept no for an answer. Scythus looked at Ethan the way a predator looks at something it intends to eat. Then he turned to the Conclave. "I invoke the trial of worth," he declared, his voice booming through the chamber. "Let the humans prove their value in the arena. Single combat. If their champion defeats my chosen warrior, I will withdraw the claim and accept the treaty. If not, the merger proceeds immediately, and these humans go back to their insignificant little world with their tails between their legs." The Conclave speaker looked to me. "Princess Valeth, the trial of worth has been invoked. Do you accept on behalf of your proposed alliance?" I looked at Ethan. He met my gaze across the chamber and nodded once. One small, steady nod. "I accept," I said. "Then name your champion." Ethan stood again. "I volunteer." A wave of sound crashed through the chamber. Laughter, mostly. Disbelief. A few scattered gasps. Scythus smiled for the first time since the session began, and it was the smile of a predator that has just been handed its meal on a silver plate. "The human himself," he said, savoring every word. "How delightful. Very well. My champion will be Vorak of the Iron Line." Vorak. I knew the name. Every person in that chamber knew the name. A Draven elite warrior, 8 feet tall, bred from a genetic line that had been optimized for combat over 40 generations. Bio-enhanced muscle fiber threaded through every limb. Reaction time faster than most targeting computers. He had competed in 23 formal trials and won every single one. He had never even been seriously wounded. I caught Ethan after the session ended, pulling him into an empty corridor before the crowds could close in around us. "This is not bravery," I said. "This is suicide. Vorak is a killing machine. He is faster than you, stronger than you, more durable than you in every measurable way. You saw the recordings I showed you during the transit. He dismantled a Thoshan berserker in 40 seconds, a creature that outweighed him by 300 pounds. I saw. And you still volunteered?" "I did." "Why?" Ethan leaned against the corridor wall. His expression was calm, but something burned behind his eyes, something fierce and steady and immovable. "Because some things are worth fighting for, even if you might lose." He looked at me, and the burning thing in his eyes softened. "And you, Valeth, are worth fighting for. Ethan, if you die in that arena, everything we have built falls apart. The treaty, the alliance, everything. I am not going to die. You cannot know that." "No, but I know something that Scythus and Vorak and every person in that chamber does not. They look at humans and they see small, soft creatures with no natural weapons, no biological enhancements, no armor, no claws, no venom. They see weakness, and every single time, throughout our entire history, that assumption has been the biggest mistake anyone has ever made about us." He pushed off the wall and walked away before I could respond. I stood in that empty corridor with my heart hammering against my ribs and the full, devastating weight of realization crashing down on me like a wave. I was in love with him. Not the political calculation my people called partnership. Not the biological impulse some species experienced as bonding. Not the cold strategic assessment of mutual benefit. Love, the human kind. The terrifying, irrational, magnificent kind that had no strategic value and no measurable outcome and made absolutely no logical sense. I was in love with a human who was going to walk into an arena tomorrow and fight a creature that could tear him apart with its bare hands. And I could not stop him, because that was who he was. That was what his species did. They saw impossible odds and they ran toward them. They calculated the risks and chose to act anyway. That was what love looked like in their world. Not a contract, not a surrender, a choice. Freely made, fully knowing the cost, and accepted without hesitation. I spent the night in my quarters unable to sleep, pacing from one end of the room to the other until I wore a path in the stone floor. I ran scenarios. I calculated angles. I reviewed everything I knew about Draven combat techniques, looking for weaknesses, gaps, anything that might tip the scales even slightly. But the truth was simple and merciless. I could not fight this battle for him. I could not control the outcome. All I could do was trust him. And that, I realized, was what love required. Not control, not certainty, trust. The arena was an ancient structure at the base of the palace mountain, a broad oval of black stone, surrounded by tiered galleries that could seat 10,000 spectators. Every seat was full. The Trial of Worth was the most significant event in the Dominion in decades, and every house, every faction, every curious observer in the sector had come to watch. The air hummed with anticipation, and the low murmur of 1,000 conversations happening at once. Scythus sat in the place of honor, his expression already triumphant. In his mind, this was a formality. The human would fall, the claim would be enforced, I would be his. I sat in the royal gallery with my hands folded in my lap and my face carefully blank, and underneath that mask, my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Vorak entered the arena first. He was enormous, even for a Draven. His body was wrapped in combat armor that covered everything except his 4 eyes and his massive forearms. He carried 2 weapons, a short-handled war axe in his primary hand and a curved blade in his secondary. His bio-enhancements were visible as faintly glowing lines beneath the exposed skin of his arms, circuits of engineered muscle fiber that multiplied his already formidable strength by a factor most species could not survive. The arena floor shook with each step he took. The crowd roared when they saw him. This was their idea of a champion, the embodiment of everything the Galactic Conclave respected. Power, size, dominance, overwhelming force. Then Ethan walked in. He wore light tactical gear, A simple chest plate, arm guards, leg guards. No helmet. His only weapon was a single combat blade, shorter than his forearm, held in a loose grip at his side. He was smaller than Vorak's shadow. He looked, by every standard the galaxy used to measure a warrior, completely and utterly outmatched. The crowd went quiet. Not in respect, in something closer to pity. Some looked away, uncomfortable, as if they were about to witness something they did not want to see. I gripped the railing of my gallery seat so hard that the metal bent under my fingers. Vorak and Ethan faced each other across 20 paces of polished black stone. The conclave speaker, Torvon, raised a ceremonial staff and recited the ancient rules of the trial. Combat until yield, incapacitation, or death. No outside interference, no ranged weapons, no activation of external enhancement devices during the fight. The staff came down. Vorak charged. The Draven moved with terrifying speed for something his size, covering the distance between them in 3 thundering strides. His war axe came down in a vertical arc that would have split Ethan from skull to waist, driving into the stone where he had stood with a crack that sent fragments flying. Ethan was not there. He moved. Not backward, not to the side, but at an angle, sliding just past the arc of the descending axe, so close that it ruffled the hair on his head. In the same motion, his blade flicked out and scored a precise line across Vorak's wrist, just above the armor plate. First blood. A thin red line on gray skin. The crowd gasped. Vorak spun, faster than something that large had any right to move, his curved blade sweeping horizontally at chest height. Ethan ducked under it, feeling the displaced air brush across his scalp, and retreated 3 crisp steps, resetting his stance. His eyes were fixed on Vorak, with an intensity I had never seen in them before. He was not afraid. He was reading, analyzing, cataloging every movement, every pattern, every fraction of a second between the start of an attack and the moment of recovery. I had seen Ethan be gentle, warm, funny, patient. Now I was seeing something else. Something that lived underneath all of that warmth, like bedrock beneath soil. This was the part of him that had survived the Ardent, the part that had held a dying ship together with his bare hands, while people he loved died around him. This was not a diplomat. This was a predator. Vorak pressed forward with a devastating combination, axe and blade working in tandem, designed to overwhelm and corner. Each blow carried enough force to shatter bone, crush armor, end a fight in a single clean stroke. Each blow missed by inches as Ethan moved with fluid, almost casual precision. He never tried to block, never tried to match force with force. He flowed around the attacks like water around stone, always moving, always just barely out of reach. The crowd's mood shifted, the pity faded, confusion replaced it, then fascination. This human was not winning. By every metric the galaxy understood, he was losing. He was smaller, weaker, slower, and he had scored exactly 1 minor hit against a warrior who was barely scratched. But he was still standing, still moving, still fighting. And something about the way he fought was deeply, fundamentally wrong by every combat doctrine the Conclave had ever seen. Every species in the galaxy fought by the same basic principles. Meet strength with strength. Hold ground. Dominate space. Close with the enemy and overpower them. Ethan did none of these things. He gave ground freely. He retreated, circled, shifted angles, offered openings that turned out to be traps. Every time Vorak lunged to finish him, Ethan was somewhere else, leaving the Draven overextended and off balance. It was like watching someone fight a river. And Vorak was getting frustrated. 3 minutes in, Vorak overcommitted on a heavy axe swing, putting his full weight behind a diagonal cut that was meant to end things decisively. Ethan stepped inside the arc, too close for the long weapon to be effective, and drove an elbow into the gap between Vorak's chest plate and shoulder guard. It was a precise, surgical strike to a nerve cluster that even bioenhancement could not fully protect. Vorak staggered. His secondary arm spasmed. Ethan was already moving away before the Draven recovered, resetting to a safe distance with footwork so clean it looked choreographed. The crowd was silent now, completely silent. 10,000 beings, and not a single sound. 5 minutes in, Vorak shifted tactics. He slowed down, became more methodical, using his superior reach to keep Ethan at distance. It was the right adjustment. The smart adjustment. If I were coaching Vorak, it was what I would have told him to do. Ethan adapted instantly. He changed his footwork, his rhythm, his approach angle. He started targeting Vorak's joints with quick, darting strikes. The knee, the ankle, the elbow. None of them powerful enough to cause serious damage individually, but they accumulated steadily, like rain wearing away stone. Each hit was placed with surgical precision, targeting the seams in Vorak's armor, the gaps between plates, the points where bio-enhanced muscle met natural tendon. Vorak was slowing, not much, not enough for the untrained eye to notice, but I saw it, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that Ethan saw it too. 7 minutes in, Vorak caught Ethan. A backhand strike from the flat of his axe that came from an angle Ethan did not anticipate. It hit his left shoulder with a crack that echoed through the silent arena like a gunshot. Ethan went down, hard. He hit the stone floor and rolled, coming up on one knee with his left arm hanging wrong, his face white with pain, his teeth clenched so tight I could see the muscles in his jaw from across the arena. I was on my feet before I knew I was moving. Every instinct screamed at me to stop this, to invoke my authority as the claimant and end the trial, to do anything at all, to keep him alive. But I did not, because he had asked me to trust him. And love, I was learning, meant honoring someone's choices even when those choices terrified you. Vorak advanced. He could smell blood. The axe came up for a finishing overhead strike, pouring every ounce of his strength and frustration, and 4 centuries of unbroken genetic legacy, into one devastating blow. Ethan lunged forward. Not back, not to the side. Forward, into the attack. He closed the distance so fast that Vorak's overhead swing sailed behind him, the axe biting into empty stone with a deafening crash. Ethan was inside his guard, pressed against the Draven's massive frame, close enough to smell the ozone of his bio-enhancements, and his blade punched upward into the gap between the chest armor plates, sliding between the segments with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Not a killing blow. He angled it deliberately, carefully, driving the blade into the muscle group that controlled Vorak's primary fighting arm, specifically into the junction where bio-enhanced fiber connected to natural sinew. The one point in the Draven warrior's body where enhancement became vulnerability, because the interface between engineered and organic tissue was always the weakest link. Vorak roared. The sound shook the arena walls. The axe clattered to the stone floor with a sound like a bell tolling. Ethan twisted the blade once, felt the muscle group sever, and withdrew it cleanly, then threw himself backward to avoid Vorak's wild retaliatory swing with the curved blade. Vorak tried to lift his axe arm. It hung limp at his side, the bio-enhanced muscle severed at a junction point that no amount of engineered fiber could compensate for. He still had his secondary weapon, still had one good arm, still outweighed Ethan by several hundred pounds, and stood 3 feet taller. But the fight was over. Everyone in the arena knew it. The mathematical certainty of it settled over the crowd like a physical weight. Vorak charged one final time, a desperate all-or-nothing assault with his curved blade. It was brave. It was futile. Ethan sidestepped at the last possible instant, caught the Draven's wrist as it passed, and used his own massive momentum against him, redirecting the charging warrior into the arena wall. Vorak hit the stone with a sound like thunder. The wall cracked. He staggered, tried to rise, and collapsed to one knee, his remaining weapon falling from fingers that could no longer grip. Ethan stood over him, bleeding from a dozen small wounds, his left arm hanging at an angle that told me the shoulder was dislocated at minimum. His chest plate was cracked straight through the middle. Blood ran down the side of his face from a cut above his eye, pooling in the hollow of his collarbone. He was barely standing. His legs trembled with the effort of remaining upright. And then he did something that nobody in that arena, not one single being among 10,000, expected. He extended his hand to Vorak. Not as a taunt, not as a mockery, not as a display of superiority. He reached down to the warrior who had been trying to kill him for the past 10 minutes, and offered to help him to his feet. Vorak stared at the hand. His 4 eyes blinked slowly, one pair after the other. The hatred in them faded. Something else took its place. Something that I do not think the Draven warrior had ever felt before in his centuries of engineered combat. He reached up and took Ethan's hand. Ethan braced himself, shifted his weight, and helped the Draven to his feet. For a moment, the two warriors stood face to face, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with politics or power or the right of claim. It was primal and ancient and beyond the reach of any law. Respect. Vorak inclined his head, the smallest gesture. But from a Draven elite who had never acknowledged an opponent's worth in his life, it was an earthquake. The conclave speaker's voice rang through the stunned silence like a hammer striking crystal. The trial is satisfied, the claim is void. The arena erupted, not in the uniform roar of triumph that I expected, but in something more complex and layered. Shock, amazement, confusion, awe. 1,000 beings who had come to watch a human die were instead confronted with something that did not fit into any category their civilization had built. A warrior who fought not to destroy but to prove a point. A champion who won and then chose grace. Strength tempered by mercy. Power governed by compassion. They had no framework for it. It broke their models. And that, I realized, was exactly the point. Scythus was on his feet in his gallery, his face contorted with fury so intense it bordered on madness. "This proves nothing," he snarled, his voice cutting through the noise. "One lucky contest does not validate an alliance with primitives." But the conclave was already moving. Torvon called an immediate vote on the sovereign refusal and the human treaty. The result was not close. House after house voted in favor, many of them houses that had been firmly in Sithis' camp that morning. They had watched the fight. They had seen what a single human could do against the best warrior their corner of the galaxy could produce, and they had seen him offer his hand afterward. That was not weakness. That was a kind of strength that no one in the conclave had ever encountered. The strength to win and then choose grace. The strength to be merciful when mercy was not required and would not be reciprocated. The strength to look at a defeated enemy and see not a trophy, but a person. Scythus stormed out of the arena, his retinue trailing behind him like the tail of a comet burning out. He would cause problems later, I was certain. But the legal battle was over, the right of claim was dead, and the treaty between the Saurian Dominion and Earth was ratified before the sun touched the western mountains. I found Ethan in the medical wing 3 hours later. He was sitting on the edge of a treatment bed, arguing with the Saurian medical staff about when he could leave, which I was beginning to understand was a fundamental and incurable human trait. He had 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder that had been set back in place, a grade 2 concussion, and more bruises and lacerations than the medical staff could catalog without a scanning system. He looked up when I walked in and grinned through a split lip. "Hey, you are the most reckless, stubborn, infuriating creature I have ever met in my entire life," I said. "You are welcome." I dismissed the medical staff with a wave. They filed out quickly, recognizing the look on a princess's face that meant she was not to be argued with. I pulled a chair beside his bed and sat down. "You could have died," I said. "I did not." "You could have. One mistake, one misjudgment, one moment of hesitation, and Vorak would have killed you. And everything we built, the treaty, the alliance, the future we fought for, all of it would have died with you." But it did not. He reached out with his good hand and touched my arm. His fingers were warm, despite the cold of the medical wing. "Valeth, I did not fight that fight because I was sure I would win. I fought it because it needed fighting, because the alternative was letting someone take your freedom, and I could not live in a universe where I stood by and let that happen. That is irrational. Absolutely, completely irrational, 100% against every sensible calculation. Humans are like that. We do the irrational thing when the rational thing would mean giving up on someone we care about. It is probably our worst quality and our best one, and I have never once been able to tell the difference." I looked at him, at the blood drying on his face, and the bruises blooming across his arms, and the ridiculous, unbreakable light in his eyes that nothing, not a Draven warrior, not a hostile conclave, not the weight of an entire galaxy bearing down on him, could extinguish. and I took his hand. Right there. In front of the security cameras that fed directly to the court, in front of the medical staff who were transparently watching through the observation window and pretending they were not. A princess of the Saurian dominion, holding the hand of a human. He looked down at our joined hands, and then back up at me, and his expression changed. The humor faded. The warrior faded. Something deeper took its place. Something quiet and vast and unshakable, like the ocean he had told me about, like the sky over his childhood coast. "Valeth," he said softly. "I vowed never to marry," I said. "I know. I am not breaking that vow, because what you have shown me is not a merger. It is not a contract. It is not a political arrangement, or a strategic alignment, or any of the 1,000 cold words my civilization uses to describe two people binding their lives together. It is something my people do not have a word for. Something we never built into our language because we never thought it was real. But my people do." "Yes." I held his gaze and did not let go. "Tell me the word." He squeezed my hand. "Love." I let the word settle into me like sunlight into frozen ground. Love. Such a small word for such an enormous thing. 4 letters in his language, no equivalent in mine, no formula to calculate it, no precedent to cite, no strategic framework to contain or control it. Just a choice, made freely, held fiercely, given without conditions or guarantees, or exit clauses. My mother came to see me that evening. She stood in the doorway of my quarters and looked at me for a long time, really looked at me, not through me, not past me, not at the political implications of my existence, at me. "Is this what you want?" she asked. "This human?" "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. The evening light from the window painted shadows across her face, and in those shadows, I saw the girl she must have been once. Before the crown, before the calculations, before she learned to trade her daughters for peace. "Your father was chosen for me," she said. "I never had what you have now." A pause. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Do not waste it, Valeth." She left, and I stood alone in the room where I had grown up, surrounded by the relics of a life that no longer fit me like a shell outgrown, and I felt something I had never felt in that room before. Hope. That night, I stood on the balcony of the palace and watched Earth's carrier group in orbit. They were small against the vast darkness, tiny points of light among the stars, barely visible, easily overlooked. 3 carriers and 18 support ships, a speck of dust against the majesty of the galactic night. But they were there, steady, unwavering, present. They had come because they chose to come. They had stayed because they chose to stay. Not because a treaty compelled them, not because a contract bound them, because a man they trusted had told them it was the right thing to do, and that had been enough. Ethan joined me after a while. His arm was in a sling, and he moved carefully, wincing when he forgot about the ribs, but he stood beside me at the railing and looked up at the same stars. "Beautiful night," he said. "Yes." We stood in silence for a while, not the cold silence of the conclave or the tense silence of the arena, a warm silence, the kind that exists between two people who do not need words to understand each other, the kind I had never experienced before, and now could not imagine living without. "My people have been building empires for 1,000 generations," I said finally. "We have conquered worlds, forged alliances that span galaxies, constructed civilizations that will endure long after the last star burns out. We have mapped every corner of the known universe, cataloged every species, mastered every technology we have encountered. And in all that time, with all that power, and all that knowledge and all that ambition, we never discovered the one thing that actually makes everything else worth having. What is that? Someone who chooses to stay, not because they must, not because it serves them, not because a contract compels them, or a law demands it, or a political calculation requires it, but because they looked at you, with all your flaws and all your fury and all your broken edges, and decided that you were worth the trouble, worth the risk, worth everything." He smiled. That quiet, steady smile that I had come to rely on more than any fleet or army or political alliance in the galaxy. Humans figured that out pretty early, he said, probably because we had nothing else. No bio-enhancements, no natural weapons, no empires, no engineered perfection. Just each other. Just these fragile, stubborn, irrational bodies, and the completely unreasonable belief that the person standing next to us was worth fighting for. And it turned out that was enough. It was always enough. I leaned against the railing and let the night air wash over me, carrying the scents of the mountain and the distant ocean and the sharp, clean cold of the stars. It was more than enough, I said. And standing there, on the balcony of the palace where I had been born and raised and imprisoned and freed, beside a human who had crossed the galaxy and fought a monster and offered his enemy mercy and done all of it for no reason more complicated than the fact that he cared, I understood something that my civilization, for all its 1,000 generations of grandeur, had never grasped. You could conquer every world in the galaxy. You could build fleets that blotted out the stars. You could forge alliances that made empires tremble and controlled trade routes spanning 1,000 light years and commanded the obedience of 1 billion souls. And none of it, not a single piece of it, would matter if there was no one beside you who had chosen to be there. Because power without love was just a machine. Efficient, unstoppable, empty. Humanity understood this. The youngest species in the galaxy, the smallest, the most fragile, the ones everyone underestimated and dismissed and called primitives. They had figured out the one truth that had eluded every great civilization since the first star was born. Love was not a weakness to be engineered out, or a vulnerability to be guarded against, or an inefficiency to be optimized away. It was the only strength that mattered, and they had carried it with them from their tiny blue world on the edge of nowhere, across the vast and indifferent dark, into the heart of an empire that had forgotten what it meant to choose. They reminded us. And we would never be the same.